Well, South Africa 2024 national and provincial elections are on the horizon, with more than 350 political parties already joining the race, and 30 of these registering with the Independent Electoral Commission in the last quarter of 2023 alone. Some analysts have seen the emergence of smaller political parties and independent candidates as a healthy developing democracy, while others have been cautious to not yet rule out the popularity of the big three political parties, that being the ANC, the DA and the EFF. But what role will smaller political parties play in this year's elections? Well, to find out, let's have a chat to Terry Tselane, who's the Executive Chairperson of the Institute of Elections Management Services in Africa, and Yanga Malotana, who is Elections Project Manager at the University of Pretoria's ESI Press. Good to have both of you. Thank you very, very much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you so much for having us, Leanne. Much appreciated.
It's an absolute pleasure. And to you as well, Terry. Thank you for your time and good to see you this year.
Thank you very much for having me, Leanne.
Yanga, let me begin with you. With over 350 parties that are currently registered with the Electoral Commission of South Africa and independent candidates also joining in, how do you feel about that? I mean, is it too much? Is it good? Is it what? Help me understand this, Yanga. From your perspective, what do you think?
Sure. I think my perspective will be coming from the practicalities and the principles that have been applied on what exactly democracy encourages in the first place. The idea of choice is very much undergirded in the principles of democracy, and usually the more choices that people have, the better. However, we have to take in the consideration that people are humans. And whenever we are faced with an insurmountable amount of choices, we usually end up having what psychologists call a choice overload, which usually results in people either making no decision at all, which is what we had seen in the previous cycles of elections, because this is not a new thing for us to have so many political parties on the list. And it results in usually lower voter turnout and people just deciding not to vote at all. And also the second part of it is just people feel overwhelmed. These options that have been offered to them are usually options that curate a message that is quite similar across all the different political parties, and people tend to just think, well, they all kind of sound the same, and it's just overwhelming to decide on what to choose one, and people retract and they just decide, well, I'm just not going to vote to begin with. It's too overwhelming for me. So that's a little bit of where I'm standing with it. Yeah,
and I can understand that perspective as well, because, I mean, Terry, we look at that paper and it starts getting intimidating, and we look at, I mean, just the thought of having a novel of political parties or candidates in front of me also starts scaring me. But let me get your opinion on this, because you've got a lot of inside info on all of this and the runnings of how these elections work. Do you feel that the emergence of a number of these breakaway smaller political parties is a sign of a maturing democracy and an electoral system, or is this just a mess?
Well, it depends really where you're coming from, but from the point of view of a citizen of a country, it's a good thing. It's good for democracy that they've got different options. They can be able to choose whoever would be able to cater for their interest. And the emergence of political parties obviously is there to fill a gap within the society that is not filled by major political parties. But if you are managing the elections, from the administration point of view, it is obviously going to be very difficult because the more political parties you have, the more logistical difficulties it creates for a person who is managing who is managing the electoral processes. So it is good for democracy, and it allows the voters to options to be able to choose whoever they want to vote for. But at the same time, as I've indicated, it may be difficult in terms of the way the election management body is going to be managing all these political parties if they decide to contest for the elections.
Yeah, so it is going to be difficult to manage, and I think that the IEC do understand that, and that's a reality. But do you think, as Yanga put it, that perhaps a lot of people will be intimidated by this and actually stay away from voting because there's just too much to take into consideration and too many choices there. Terry, I'm asking this one to you.
Of course, it can create difficulties for a voter if you've got in one ballot paper all these political parties, or if the ballot paper is actually such that it becomes multiple pages. It is going to be difficult for a voter to be able to make a choice, and it can be very intimidating. But you may remember also that even though the political parties register with the IEC, not all of them register to contest the elections at the national level. So some of them have registered to contest municipal elections, and some would only contest one municipality. Others should contest at the provincial level and not all the provinces. It depends on the strength of the political party, and hopefully we will not find the situation where the ballot paper is so long or it's multiple pages to the extent that it can create confusion for a voter.
So obviously we're seeing now the new political parties, Yanga, going out and that are coming in, contesting these elections. And I mean, we literally just give one example of a manifesto that we saw coming out this weekend, and that, of course, was RZanzi. So, you know, this is also a very important part, so that South Africans can get to know who the different parties are, what they stand for, and also understanding what they do offer the voters. So let's sort of take a look at that. Obviously, we've got your bigger parties that are more established, and we sort of by now know what they do stand for. But these smaller ones, do you think it's important that, or do you think it'll be possible, in and amongst all of the noise of so many parties coming through, that they will be able to have their voices heard?
Sure. I think, just to touch on what Terry had said related to how the ballots are going to run, and the fact that a political party is not limited to just running for the national seating in Parliament, for example. A lot of the smaller parties, if we're arguing an optimistic perspective, are targeting constituents that they know are going to vote for them and are going to back them in the specific objective that they have. And it is possible, however, to be slightly cynical, though, that some of the other breakaway parties that have come from this are parties where those leaders were very highly disillusioned from their own political parties, their original political parties, and that's the reason why they had started what they've started. And it's more of a decision of what personal gain that they can get out of it. But overall, I think it would be very difficult to expect South Africans to sit and try to figure out all the different manifestos and policy standings of close to 350 political parties. And even if what ends up being on the ballot itself, once those parties do get through the administrative process with the IEC, which is quite costly, and if those political smaller parties survive the financial implications for it and they end up being there, the question is, what unique perspective do they have that has enabled them to even be on the ballot in the first place? And also, what mechanisms are they going to have to be able to have support that goes and extends beyond particularly social media? And one could argue that once we look at the first voter registration weekend that the IEC had, a lot of the smaller parties actually targeting young issues that a lot of youth people have. And the growing number of new voters are young people, which is a good thing, but the number still remains relatively low. And so we shouldn't be surprised if the smaller parties end up not necessarily surviving because of financial implications, or number two, the fact that a lot of them might only have a following on social media that doesn't translate into the financial push that puts them on the ballot in the first place. Hence, then making it possible for people to just see the choices that were already there from the beginning. So that's kind of like the way I view it from that perspective.
Yeah. Let's dwell a little, Terry, if you don't mind, on this manifesto launch. I mean, we see something like the small political party RZanzi coming and going early in terms of putting out what they stand for and talking to this manifesto. They speak, obviously, when we saw Zongezo Zibi speaking to some of the promises, and a lot of it, you know, is talking to what frustrates South Africans and wanting to end hunger and wanting a whole bunch of things that obviously many of us speak to. But the one thing that they did speak to was leadership, and they brought about something where they were saying that they actually wanted to bring in somebody like this committee to be chaired by Brigalia Baum, the former chairperson of the Electoral Commission, that is going to vet candidates for their political party. So not to just have this kind of, whatever we call it, where they actually not just given positions on allegiance, but they rather get there on merit. What do you think of this? I mean, some of the political parties and what they are saying.
Well, as you correctly pointed out, some of the political parties have identified a gap within the society that they believe will be able to make them competitive. And that gap currently seems to be the leadership question. And then therefore, the political parties such as RZanzi are trying to capitalize on that to try to make sure that they can, through their processes, be able to elect ethical leadership that can actually be able to carry the country forward. Because we have seen quite a number of complaints about the kind of the leadership we have in various areas. And it is that Mzansi is basically the gap that they're basically trying to close within the society.
And that's one of the big things that I think, particularly when we look at the apathetic voter, doesn't want to go out and vote. And Terry, let me again ask you this question. There is a lot of voter apathy out there, and people want some political parties to actually talk directly to them. How do you do that? Because at the end of the day, there have been a lot of breakaway parties and smaller parties that have really struggled when it comes to elections and to actually get the votes. Do you think this young, energized feeling that we've got amongst these new parties that are coming, do you think that they will be able to make a difference and attract voters that are staying away from the polls from what history has told us?
Well, hopefully so, because if you look at the last registration weekend, we're beginning to see more and more young people beginning to register compared to the previous elections. And hopefully they are registering as a result of a hope that the new political parties represent, or even the older political parties that are there, that are beginning to say things that resonate with the public and the voters. And we will be able to detect this properly after the elections if the majority of young people have actually been able to vote for one political party or the other. We can then be able to see as to whether the strategies have worked. But I think increasingly political parties are also beginning to reach young people in forums where they are available. Social media particularly is being used. Twitter, TikTok, and all these other platforms are being used. And I think compared to the previous occasions where political parties focus largely only on rallies, there is a new way of dealing with issues. There's a new way of trying to reach young people. There's a way of trying to speak their language, to go to the platforms where they are available. And then I think hopefully that will also begin to increase the number of people who will be able to participate in the process.
Indeed, and Yanga, I mean, that's something that we, I suppose, need to look at very, very carefully as well. I mean, we've seen social media, it's active, people get involved, but does it translate into votes? And I know you brought up that topic a bit earlier. Your view, and I think a lot of people will want to get your view on this, is the analysis of new parties that we've seen coming in, such as Mkhonto Wesizwe and the African Congress for Transformation. Very quickly, do you think that they may bring in that apathetic voter that perhaps was going to vote, then decided, I don't like what's going on, but now see these parties and say, hang on, I'm coming back?
Yeah, I would argue that instead of an apathetic voter that they would bring in, they would actually be bringing in the frustrated voters that were likely in the constituency of the ANC in particular. But when it comes to the apathetic voters, oftentimes the demographic for that is usually not necessarily the base constituents of the main parties, but the young people. But 100% there is, from a social media perspective, there is a mood amongst young people where there's this desire to vote. There is this understanding as well about the power of the vote. But there's also a bit of a blockade where young people still get to a standstill and they say, okay, fine, I do want to vote, but then they arrive and they say, oh my goodness, I have all these parties to choose from. I don't know where to move forward from there. And so I think that's a very important situation that we have to consider, is that the apathy now is no longer just an apathy of disinterest and purely I'm resigning from democracy, I don't care about the system. It's more of I realize that democracy is very important and I realize that I have the power to vote, but I'm overwhelmed by the amount of options I actually have, and the fact that I have this responsibility of needing to decide one person to vote for me is the next step that young people have to take. And I commend the IEC with their particular social media platforms and ad campaigns that they've had to encourage young people to register to vote, because I'd argue that's why we've gotten to that point. But political parties have a long way to go as well.
I got to leave it there. I wish I could carry on, but I can't. Terry Tselane, it's a good starting point, I think, from where we're going this year, because it's a big year. Terry Tselane and, of course, Yanga Malotana talking to us about the huge choices we have when it comes to this year's elections.